when I was in college, some fellow started a group called Homosexuals Intransigent, HI. It was the second college campus queer group. The first one was a few months earlier at Columbia, which was a stone's throw from CCNY in Harlem. That was Student Homophile League. And Craig Rodwell, who was the owner of the Oscar Wilde bookstore, and he had just opened it, was one of the featured speakers to come to the group. So he and I became friends, and I would go down to his shop, and I was 17, I guess, or so. Maybe a little old, 18, 19. It's 1967, I guess. And still, things were really scary. We had Dick Leitch come to speak from the Madison Society, and but Stonewall hadn't yet happened. So, but I remember my feeling in those days was that my life would be difficult and that be unhappy. That I remember having sex with a guy who was a medical student at Columbia, and he told me he said he could not reveal to anyone that he was gay, or he would be denied he would go through all his school and he wouldn't be able to become a doctor. He wouldn't get his license because of a clause called moral turpitude, that people weren't able to become professionals. They wouldn't let you into the bar, the legal profession, or, so it was pretty, the message was there. It was pretty dismal, In those days, I didn't hear a lot about religious condemnation. That was more, the coverage they got was more a response to the gay liberation movement. But in those days, you certainly intuited that, and I knew that I could not be open because it wasn't safe. You were physically in danger of being attacked by homophobes. And also there was the sense of shame that you would bring to your family and your community. I mean, it was the tenor of the day was that we were other. We were sinners, we were criminals, we were sick. So all of the culture's institutions in a silent conspiracy were telling us that we were less than, and in fact made us our own jailers. We couldn't be authentic because there was a price to pay. We couldn't tell our own truth because if we did, even if we didn't have immediate repercussions, the fear that I heard from gays who were a little bit older than I was is that you'd ruin your possibility for a career. You'd never get hired. I was a kid, I was out since I was 13, so I had those years of nothing, kind of like a wasted adolescence. We queers end up having our adolescence often in our 20s, because, we're just being inauthentic during that period. I remember the pain of going to dances where all these budding little heterosexual feelings were coming out for everybody else, and standing in the corner and feeling apart and feeling like, what kind of life am I going to have? Fortunately, I was never in danger I never had suicidal thoughts. I think I had a fairly strong sense of self, but I was despairing of my future. The 60s were this cauldron of activity where the baby boomers were reinventing themselves. And then it was our turn to reinvent ourselves. So we had all these movements. We had certainly the war the anti-war movement kind of brought a lot of people together. And then Black Power and feminism. And I've always seen gay liberation as just another side of the same coin of feminism. That feminism says that, gay liberation says that you should be able to choose a partner of whatever gender you want, and feminism is larger than that and says you should be able to do whatever you want. You should have no limits put on you because of your gender. So I think one is just a subset of the other. Well, I was going to the group at CCNY, and I was going down to the Village and hanging out some at Oscar Wilde, and beginning to meet a few other gay people. My best friend from high school and I came out to each other at that point, and that was very important because that was the first time I was having a real intimate connection with another gay man. We weren't boyfriends, but we were best friends, and that was great. I had gone to the Stonewall. I had a lesbian cousin, and she was kind of a femme. She was a femme, and she and I went down to the Stonewall for the first time, and we had to knock on the door, and there was a little peephole, kind of straight out of The Wizard of Oz, and they looked at us and they wouldn't let us in because I guess they thought we were straight. You know, that didn't happen very often, being mistaken for straight, but it did then. And then I remember my cousin called me on the Saturday morning, the 28th of June, 1969, to tell me, "Did you hear what happened at the Stonewall last night?" And I hadn't. So that was my first time I heard about it. There was a law on the books that's a New York state law that said you could not sell alcohol to a known homosexual. And I find it fascinating to have lived this long in the first place, when so many of my friends did not, and to see what are the issues that we concern ourselves with, like, you know, same-gender marriage, when in the old days, it was things like, could you be served a drink in a bar, or could the owner of the bar be cited for selling a homosexual drink? So that's the mechanism by which the bars were mob-controlled in New York. The mob would pay off the local police precinct to let them operate, and then periodically the cops would want more money, so they'd stage a raid of the bar, sometimes arresting people there in the bar, sometimes publishing their names in the newspaper, but most often just closing the bar for the night. The payoff to the cops would go up, and the next night the bar would open and everything would be as it had been. But it was astonishing that there was this community response saying, this is our bar, we're having fun, and we're not going to take it anymore. After Stonewall, I give credit to the Gay Liberation Front, which was, I believe, the first gay liberation group that formed saying, hey, let's not lose this energy. There was so much excitement about Stonewall because it went on for several days, and it was a turning point. It was a huge turning point. So Gay Liberation formed, and it was formed by folks who had experience in all those movements I mentioned, the anti-war movement, feminism, Black Power. The problem, as I see it, with Gay Liberation Front is they were all over the map. They were a multi-issue organization that made important connections between corporate America and the oppression of all these different folks. However, in practical terms, their focus kept them from gay liberation. So I went to GLF, and it was astonishing to walk in a room of all these gay people. That was eye-opening. That was new. And everybody was a hippie. I found it very intimidating at the same time because most of them were a little bit older than I and a little more sophisticated. And I remember the conversation I walked in on was whether or not GLF should give $500 to the Black Panthers from the proceeds of a dance that they had held. And I just listened there to the debate, and some folks said, well, we have to give it to them because they're more oppressed than we are. They're getting their heads clubbed. And then other people argued that, well, they're still calling everybody faggot. And why should we give them money? Shouldn't we spend that money on gay liberation? And then I was in my last term at CCNY, and I was driving a taxi cab to bring in a little money. And I'm driving down Park Avenue, and I can't believe my eyes. There's a gay demonstration going on, and I can see signs and people yelling and screaming. And I quickly discharged my passenger where she was going and flipped on my off-duty sign and raced back and parked the cab in a cab zone and joined the demonstration. I went over, and it was my first gay demonstration, and it was a little terrifying to join. I was standing in the crowd watching it at first, and there were these young secretaries who were saying, oh, he sure looks gay, oh, he doesn't look gay at all, and that was the tone of it. And then Arthur Evans led a gay power chant. You know, give me a G, give me an A, give me a Y, spelling out gay power. And I found myself chanting along. And by the end of the chant, I was as loud as anybody, and all these people who I've been standing with backed up. So all of a sudden, I'm standing halfway between the onlookers and the demonstration. At that point, it was easier to join than not, so I went and I found a sign that I liked, and I started marching back and forth. And Arthur came over to me immediately, and he said, you just joined, good for you, good for you. The reason for the demonstration fascinates me. It was Household Finance Company, which is a lender, an insurance company, and they had a policy of not lending money or not insuring gay people, known gay people, because we were more, according to them, we were more likely to kill each other off to collect on the insurance. But of course it wasn't true. It was just, that's what we were dealing with. So the next thing I knew, nobody told me what was going on. The entire group, after the picketing, ran into the building, and I got swept up with them. And we ended up riding up this elevator to the president's office and sitting down. And a bunch of people got arrested. We'd sit down in somebody's office and chant, and they'd flip out and they'd call the police, and the police would come and they'd say, if you don't leave, you're going to be arrested. So people who had agreed to be arrested would stay and everybody else would leave. And then we'd get a little bit of media. I was hooked on GAA at that point. That was early 1971. My time in Gay Activists Alliance specifically marked me forever. It shaped my life. Joining GAA was coming home. I could be authentic. I could tell the truth. I, for the first time, met kindred spirits. I always was well-friended, but this went beyond that because there was part of me that was, being hidden. So, and I'm so proud of what we accomplished. Out of that organization, the blueprint for what has happened in the last 40 years was created. For example, GAA introduced a bill called Intro 475 to the City Council of New York to protect gay people from being fired and losing homes and being served in public. It was the first of its kind. We called it the Out of the Closet Bill. And it was an organizing principle. And it was less important that it pass than it was that we use it to educate the public that we were, in fact, part of them. So Tom Dorr was one of the members of GAA, great guy. He was a graphic artist, and he designed our symbol, which was the lambda, which has remained my favorite symbol. I even had a dog named Lambda. May she rest in peace. And the lambda was on buttons and it was on T-shirts, and we would wear them and people would say, "What's that?" And you'd say, "Oh, it's a lambda, it's a symbol of gay liberation." And then after you pick them up off the floor, you'd explain to them what was going on, and it was a way to come out. It was a tool, it was a device. Our organization had a debate about whether or not we should include, we didn't call it transgender in those days, it was transvestites. And they were trying to argue that they were looking for amendments: no transvestites, no teachers, no firemen, no cops. Gay Activist Alliance debated whether or not we should exclude transvestites or any of those professions in order to make it more likely that the bill passed. And what carried the day, the side I was on, and I was very happy about it, is that we saw it as the out of the closet bill. The struggle to get the bill was the victory. Now, yeah, it's important to have those rights, and I don't diminish them, but not at the expense of our community. So we had that first gay rights bill introduced, which spread all over the country. As a matter of fact, that was, I believe it was introduced in December of '70. And there's a whole long history of what happened with the hearings, but it didn't pass until 1986. In the meantime, there were I think over 100 bills around the nation. We had an expression, a zap a day keeps the shrink away. It was taking all that internalized self-hatred, where we were our own jailers, you know, all the messages of a homophobic culture telling us that we were bad, and turning it outward directly on the source of the oppression. We were taking it up to the president, and even though we never got to see the president, we were causing trouble for the company. We were interrupting business as usual. That was very significant about a ZAP, saying you can't just go along with things the way they are. You have to hold accountable those who are in decision making. And often it meant making things difficult, stopping business, and then it would filter up. The thing about GAA that is extraordinary to me was the sense of empowerment that I learned. It shaped me for the rest of my life. I've been an activist these last 40 years, and that comes from knowing that my actions can have a difference. I'm very cynical about the future of the world, but it hasn't stopped me from, within my own world, being an activist, because I experienced what we could accomplish